Well, hello there. It's always nice to come and talk with people about software development since I work in marketing nowadays. It keeps my, things real for me, if you will. All right. Well, as introduced, I've been an analyst for many years of my life, which is more or less the capacity I'm going to be talking about today, what I was seeing when I was an analyst in the CI and CD space. And I'll probably just say continuous delivery because that's a mouthful to say all of that. So you can see all of my background there, but most recently I was at 451 Research heading up a couple of practices, focusing on infrastructure software and software development and DevOps and things like that. And I've also worked at RedMonk, if you've heard of them, an interesting little firm focused on developers. And I've done a lot of work, well, I guess 2 years worth of work, felt like a lot of work, when I was over in Round Rock at Dell, helping build out the software group by doing corporate strategy and M&A, which gives you an interesting perspective on everything to do software at a hardware company like that. And I was basically a programmer for about 10 years at tiny places and big weird places like BMC Software, which was equally educational in a fun way. We can entertain ourselves about SNMP and WMI and stuff like that later if you're having trouble going to sleep tonight. So I always like to start my presentations with conclusions, so you can, check your email or update your Twitters or do whatever is more important and interesting to me, and yet get some valuable points. So there's 4 things I'm going to be going over today. And as introduced, the point of this talk is to kind of step maybe back and up a lot from the great talk that we just saw and see what's going on as we'll get to what I like to call the donkeyscape, the very normal mainstream world of continuous delivery. And I want to go over this to give some context and some yardsticking, if you will, some benchmarking to understand from an optimistic perspective that the glass is half full, if you will, or maybe an eighth full, and how much of that glass is left to fill out, and also get a sense for what's going on out there in sort of the normal world, if you will. And as we'll see, the use of continuous delivery is actually a lot more smaller, if you will, or lower than you would expect for something that's looks as tasty and delicious and has such a long, rich, sort of proven history out there. But in recent years, there's been a tremendous amount of growth in mainstream adoption of it. And the next part, which is largely it kind of reflects what I would talk about with a broad audience about this, again, with my industry analyst hat on, is to go over how people are thinking about how they fit continuous delivery into their process and thinking about it as a pipeline, if you will, as a factory, which I'm sure this metaphor and these words are familiar to a lot of people here, but it's something that's not quite, even as we were alluding to earlier in the Nike presentation, it's not quite a sort of in the water, if you will, like other things might be in development. And more importantly, once you start thinking about things that way, there's a lot of optimization and even sort of business think to wrap around it that's useful. And then finally, because you can't really have a talk without talking about containers and Docker, we'll basically go over how over the past year or so containers have been affecting things. So as I was mentioning, more or less, I'm very interested in donkeys, if you will. And if you're not familiar with this metaphor, this cartoon kind of captures it perfectly. Whenever, especially in this geography, whenever you're talking about software development and cloud and services and technologies, there's this notion of a unicorn, right? Like the sort of like mythical, like paid probably $300,000 a year or more sort of team of developers who can do whatever, and they can just sort it out, and things are awesome, right? And these are sort of like the Netflixes and as we used to say, the .coms, the Facebooks, and in the DevOps space, the Etsy's, and all these people of the world. And it's almost, someone even used this phrase earlier, like, that's great for them, right? But what do we do in the real world? And the sort of, to continue the metaphor nowadays, sounds like Nike is well on the way to growing a horn, but so someone in that space is essentially often called a horse, right? A thoroughbred. Like horses are pretty awesome. I don't know. I'm from Texas. They're great. Nothing to be frowned upon at all. They're beautiful beasts, and I have a daughter. I'm sure she'll like them one day. But I think most people that I've spent my life studying and trying to understand are that smart guy, that clever guy over there on the right, the donkey, who's basically strapped a carrot to his head. And he's just trying to sort of get along and just use technology in a way that's not going to blow the wheels off of the place. And I think that's, especially when I was at 451, when I was only there for about a year and a half, but I wanted to take that opportunity to look at those donkeys pretty in depth. And to do that, we put together 2 studies about DevOps, which, don't tell anyone, but it was really just my way of gathering together a bunch of survey information about what the donkeys were up to in cloud and software development and what their desires were. And you know, I tend to use a lot of data in my presentations just because it's easy to hide behind, I guess, and it looks pretty. But this data comes from the first study that we did that was about 200 people who were definitely donkeys. There were not a lot of high-tech people in there, even though they kind of pop up here. And it is, you know, there's a lot of disclaiming to be done around all surveying. There's only 201 people, and they're all in North America, and so forth and so on, right? But this right here, for me, represented what was the sort of pull for not only continuous delivery, but things like DevOps and cloud. And that is this notion of, like, you know, everyone wants a pony, to continue the sort of equestrian metaphors here. You know, like, of course you want to release your software faster, right? Like, that's something that I think a lot of people here would take for granted and definitely say that companies would want to do. But, you know, when you're an analyst, you have to verify and go ask things. So it's interesting to look at these survey answers. You know, in aggregate, you can see the total over here. Like, it looks pretty good, right? Like, over half the market, it all depends on how you word things, is interested in releasing their software faster, right? Now, other people might actually be releasing their software faster, and they don't need to speed it up, right? It's already fast enough. But the reason I like to share this chart is because of this, you know, one, it's a fun excuse to use skewed text like this. But it shows you by industry, these are like all the donkey people here mostly. There's a few like horses and unicorns in here. But it shows you that across industries, there is a pretty interesting interest in delivering their software faster and getting one of the main benefits of continuous delivery. Now, it's always wise to look at the extremes, right? The middle is always very exciting, and we could look in there. I'm never really sure what discrete manufacturing is. Like, I guess they don't tell people what they're up to. But, you know, it's obvious, there's obvious things like entertainment. You know, they want to release things more frequently. And to counterbalance that, it's a little confusing that gaming's over here. This might be one of the ones where by using continuous delivery and cloud and all sorts of things like that, they're perfectly fine with how fast they're releasing. But, you know, there's other things. Obviously, retail is in here. That all makes sense. And transportation can be a little confusing until you realize there's things like FedEx and UPS and Uber and stuff like that in there. So that's an industry that's taking advantage of the sort of consequences of continuous delivery and DevOps and all this fun new stuff quite a bit. And, you know, these slides are online. You can go excite yourself by looking at all the categories. But I think this context is important to keep in mind because it sort of lays out the problem, if you will. So what I would like to do as one of these horses, donkeys, or even unicorns is basically get my software out the door more frequently. And why do I want to get my software out the door more frequently? I mean, I think there's two main, what I would call strategic reasons to do that. One of them is just, on the face of it, creating a steady drip of software, right? My users, my customers want more features more frequently, right? They want, if you could think of, I always like to think of retail banking applications, right? Like I use a fun little credit union back in Austin, and they don't really update their software so much. I would love it if they would update it more frequently and could start like getting software out more to add new features to it. I mean, I look forward to new features, as I'm sure most people here do. But there's a part that a lot of people end up forgetting, and that's this feedback loop here, right? So you've gone through all this hassle to set up a software delivery pipeline, which has been nicely documented since about 2010 or so, and recently revised in this great book down here you can check out. But you know, you've got all of your seemingly development things, your building, packaging things up, and then your production concerns over here. And what's often left off, and the part that I see, or you know, that I see companies struggling with the most, is this part on the bottom, the feedback loop, and what they do with this continuous delivery process once they have it set up. And so the way to think through this is that if you're used to releasing on, you know, we'll use the old straw man of a waterfall process, which I'll kindly, let's narrow it down to like 6 months. Let's say between 6 and 12 months, you can get a release of your software out. And then, you know, there's a certain amount of your customers upgrading and getting a hold of your software. So we'll just kind of round that up to about a year or so. You basically have a year window of feedback to figure out if you made a good choice. Like, it's going to take you a long time to react and course correct and figure out if your software is successful, whatever that successful thing may be. But if you tamp that back down to a week, or if you achieve some sort of, like, you know, hardened horn on your head instead of a soft carrot, like to a day or so, I mean, can you imagine like the sort of like feedback and data you would get about people using your software? Now, again, like looking through the attendee list, This is sort of like, oh, it's time for a nap. This is very boring to go over this stuff. But if you look in the donkey area, right, like what normal mainstream companies are doing, this notion that they would be releasing on a weekly basis to actual production with features is kind of crazy. It seems like something that they only read about like in blogs that they might half understand, or crazy books that they're reading through, right? But that desire, as we saw in the first chart, is very palpable, right? Like people want IT to be nice, and they want to release their software more frequently. And increasingly, whether you want to call it continuous delivery or the kind of more sort of Uber concept of DevOps and cloud delivery, there are ways that look to be safe that you can be using and deploying, as we were seeing earlier in that great presentation from Nike, to achieve that software delivery pipeline, if you will. So to prove the point, hopefully you've been entertaining yourself with this depressing donut over here and the other charts over there while I'm talking. But part of, in the surveys that we did, on the left side, you can see where we asked people what kind of CI and CD tools are you using. And I've abbreviated a lot of the categories here to look nice on the slide. They actually, were much longer answers, so you can trust that the data is good. But there's a few things when you look at this depressing donut that should depress you, if the word depressing hasn't done that already. So one, here's the sort of like glass half or a fourth full or an eighth, which is CI products and CI and CD products like Jenkins and Bamboo or whatever you might be using, and the hosted ones like CircleCI and others. There's actually, let's be loose with the numbers. Let's say between 25 and 30% of people in the mainstream market are using those products. Whether they're, let's see if I get the acronyms right, whether they're OTC or highly customized OSS, like they're doing the nice thing of reusing code instead of inventing it on their own. And then there's this weird little bunch up here who like are not actually using products, but they're writing their own platform and their own way of doing delivery. Now, if you sort of work at a vendor and you're a developer, that's sort of what you do, right? Like you write your own things and you reuse your code, and maybe you don't like re-implement how URLs are handled or string tokenizers, hopefully. But maybe the way that you achieve, your differentiation and the features you have is to write your own things. But keep in mind that most of these people are not software vendors, right, or startups. They're people who have, normal jobs, doing normal things. And so the idea that they would be building their own delivery pipeline is a little weird, right? It's one thing to assemble together a bunch of open source products and make that all work custom fit to you, but doing your own homegrown stuff is a little alarming. Now, what's even more alarming is this category of none, hence me putting it in red. Let's be generous and say somewhere between like 25 and 30% of people aren't doing any continuous delivery, right? And when you add my, if I've disparaged doing your own stuff enough, when you add these two together, that sort of shows you that there's a fair amount of people who don't have a nice continuous delivery pipeline set up, aren't really using something there. And yet, they still desire to move faster. Over there? Yeah, well, I speak in pretty hyperbolic terms. It's not alarming. It's more to the point that, in my view, at least when I was a developer, there were certain things that I would work on. I would want my development teams spending their effort on the application, right? Not really spending their development time on the build and the pipeline, right? And in the longer version of this talk, I make a joke about the build guy I used to work with who didn't believe in the moon landing, right? And it's sort of like the build person is always a little weird, and it's not only the person that's weird, but the notion that like it becomes a bottleneck, as we'll get into, where like they almost become like one of those demigods, like the DBAs, right? Like you've got to get it past the build person, and then as we were talking about, then there's the release management team and the bi-weekly change review board. It's just like yet another thing that you're dealing with. And again, this is my personal anecdotal experience, but you end up customizing this build, and then that person gets a raise whenever they ask for it, right? Like they become indispensable, which is not cool, right? Like your bus number on the build is way low, if not fractional, right? Given the moon landing. So to sort of, does that address the question? All right, great. So it's one thing to pay attention to one sad donut, spilled on a slide, but now that I don't work for 451, I can sort of be, us analysts hate referring to other studies. So I went out and looked at some of the literature, commissioned as it was, as the same as ours was. But D-Zone has a nice year over year, they've done 2 years of surveying about continuous delivery. And, you know, the numbers never match up for these sort of things, but you reach similar conclusions by looking at what they've surveyed year over year, and their ins were quite a bit larger. So you can go look up these reports down here and see the criteria for what they mean by believe doing CD and doing textbook CD. But essentially what they're saying is they ask companies if they were doing continuous delivery, believe doing CD, and you can see that's been growing at an interesting rate, so that's positive. But according to some criteria that they developed, which I think they pulled from the the continuous delivery Bible, if you will, there has been great 10% growth over a year is awesome. We can even knock it down to 5 or 6 if you want to get all margin of error happy. But essentially, I mean, this is I think paucity is the right word. There's a small amount of the surveyed base who are actually doing textbook CD, which maybe they've come up with some non-textbook CD thing that's awesome, and they're doing that instead. But the whole point is, again, if you look at the donkeyscape, right, doing continuous delivery is not like a mainstream concern like maybe even unit testing probably is nowadays. I don't have a fancy slide on that. But there's a lot of practices that evolved over the past 10 or so years in the same time that continuous delivery has that have become more widely used than CD. So, you can be an optimist and think this is, the glass is half full, there's a lot of room, you can like move and use this to your advantage. You can be a pessimist and try to say that like it doesn't matter or, it doesn't apply to me. I mean, obviously I fall more into the first camp, if you will. Like to me, that data point along with many others informs, the sort of like this fat Boy Scout thinking down here, which is, so if you remember the service delivery chart that we had a few slides back, the one that was from 2010 from Damon Edwards and those guys and has been updated recently. This is sort of a, I like to use smart art as much as possible, so this is my version of it. And it sort of allows us to peer into it in a way that also uses pivotal colors, so that's dandy. But basically, you've got this general process which we keep renaming and it goes over and over again. Of you got to know what you're coding. You got to code it. You do your version controlling and build and testing, and you package it up. And then over here, you've got operations where nowadays it's sort of like cloud or highly tuned VMs you're deploying to, and then all your production concerns. Remember SNMP? Over here. Well, at least in my day. And then you can kind of see where development is and where CI/CD is and ops, if you will. And these things shift around a lot, but this is sort of like your best hope at the moment if you sort of average down to the mainstream. And again, there's a feedback loop. Now, to the point that I was making a little earlier in answering the question, especially when I was an analyst and now when I'm at Pivotal, obviously, I like to emphasize for people to focus on this area, right? Especially if you're not a technology company, it feels like where you're going to achieve competitive advantage, and for those who don't bore themselves reading a bunch of East Coast strategy books, that basically means the reason that customers buy from you instead of your competitors. If you're writing code, it seems like your best bet for competitive advantage is going to be your code, your actual application and software, right? Like if your build's really fast but your code's not good, who cares, right? And on and on and on. Like now, obviously, you need your stuff up and running, and if you're besieged with botnets who are trying to arbitrage shoes, then you've got some crazy concerns over here that you need to pay attention to. But still, your code is very important, right? You can't go to a vendor and buy that code. On the other hand, like all this other stuff, I'm not saying that you need to necessarily off the shelf or off the web it, but it's probably worth wondering if you're writing this stuff customized, from the ground up. There's probably something a little weird going on. Like you're probably shaving the wrong yak, if you will. Right, and to that point, for all of my glee of using off the web or off the shelf things, right? It's important to be aware of the fat Boy Scout problem in your pipeline. Which, if you remember the goal way back when, there's been a nice rewriting of it for us nerds called the Phoenix Project. But one of the epiphanies in there is basically, if I've got a line of Boy Scouts, I'm only going to move as fast as the slowest one of them, which is sort of like another duh epiphany. But when you apply that to a pipeline, what it means is find your bottlenecks, find the slowest point, and you should spend a lot of your effort on speeding those up. Because to your point, if you have what was it, the vertical spaghetti bowl or something, like if that's kind of what's going on over here, then that's your fat Boy Scout, and it's worth your time to detangle that spaghetti, or maybe just eat it all, I guess, or something. But somehow you want to like slim down your Boy Scout, or be happy with the speed that he's moving, essentially. So to that end, one of the things that's been helping eat that spaghetti over the past year has been really the rise in Docker specifically, but it's generalized out to containers to a large degree, thanks to many people who would like to see it not controlled by one force, essentially. And there's all sorts of exciting statistics up here from Docker. And there's even one of the ways that I detect when a technology is sort of taking hold is when there's what I would characterize as early potholes along the hype cycle, right? So Docker and containers may be brand new, but you already have these, like if you follow this link, which you can't click on now, there's even like these vitriolic posts of how like Docker ruined my life. And it's like a nice sign to show that we're approaching the trough of disillusionment, which if you remember comes right before the plateau of productivity, which is where your spaghetti crafters really like to exist. So things look to be going nicely in that area. And whenever you see a lot of logos on a slide, that basically means like there's a lot going on, right? Like things are confusing and nothing has settled down yet. It's very exciting for people. But it's interesting to reflect on using my simplified, nicely pivotal colored pipeline here, where containers and new technologies are fitting in. And almost, let me see if this is true. It's probably true that in most every phase of production, there's at least one body, if you will, one entity who's interested in doing something with containers there, right? And it's kind of little wonder because a lot of the current craze around containers comes from what was ostensibly, well, not even ostensibly, what was a platform as a service, a developer, a middleware company, right? And so it's finely tuned to basically help you out on this production pipeline here. So that's really something that's like come out from the middle of nowhere, if you will, over the past year. That's interesting to look at. So with that, you can like put yourself to sleep with some data there. Click on the links if you want to follow the links or pester me here or otherwise. But I appreciate the chance to talk with you guys and go over this stuff.